Today we will learn about Socket.io and how it makes writing powerful, real-time WebSocket applications easy. Hello and welcome, I'm Dave. Today I will provide an introduction to Socket.io, and I'll provide links to all resources in the description below. I'll also provide a link for you to join my Discord server where you can discuss web development with other students, and you can ask questions that I can answer and receive help from other viewers too. I look forward to seeing you there. In the previous lesson, we set up a simple mono repo with a client and server using WebSockets. Today we're going to modify our code from the previous lesson and introduce Socket.io, which provides some powerful features. Today's starter code is the completed code from Lesson 1 in this chat app series. The course resources link in the description provides the code for each lesson. So what's the difference between Socket.io and simply using WebSockets? Well, I'm glad you asked, and they list that in their frequently asked questions. Now, we already covered WebSockets, and here it says WebSockets are awesome, and it lists some of their benefits. But it also says WebSockets are also pretty low level, and developing real-time applications with WebSockets often requires an additional layer over them. And that's essentially what we get with Socket.io. And it gives some of the benefits here where it says they can fall back to HTTP long polling in case the WebSocket connection can't be established. That's one of the benefits of Socket.io. Another is an automatic reconnection if you get your connection closed, if the WebSocket closes. Acknowledgements to send some data and expect a response from the other side. Broadcast to all, or this is important, a subset of connected clients. Of course, scale the app to multiple instances of the server. That's important if you're writing a more complex application. And connection recovery for short periods of disconnection. You're not going to lose those things you sent. They will send once it's reconnected. So quite a few benefits. We're just going to go over an introduction in this tutorial and look at the basic setup and some improvements over what we did in the previous lesson where we just used WebSockets. A quick note before we get into VS Code. After some feedback from the first video in this series, I've decided to go forward with the ES6 import syntax instead of using the common JS require syntax. But I could just be listening to a vocal minority, and I want to make sure you understand it's not really a requirement. It's more of a preference at this point, because if you do not specify that you're using ES6, essentially this ECMAScript modules that it talks about here, the default is still the common JS module loader. Now there's three ways you can enable the import syntax, and we can do that with the MJS file extension, which indicates it's a module, not just a JS file. Also in the package JSON, we can specify the type and say module there, or we can use the input type flag. I'm going to use the package JSON option. So let's go back to VS Code and set this up. I'm now in VS Code, and just underneath this line 5, where it says main and index.js, let's add a new line, and we'll put in type, and after this, we'll put module. And that's really all you need to do in a Node.js project to enable the import syntax. While we've got the package JSON open, I want to add some dependencies today. One is a dev dependency, so let's do that first. Control and the backtick to open the terminal window. Type npm I. Oh, you know what? We're in this mono repo, and so we also need to make sure that we're not up in this lesson 2 folder. I need to once again cd into the server folder, because that's where we actually have our package JSON. Glad I caught that. Now let's go ahead and say npm I, then -D for dev, and add nodemon. Nodemon is a dev dependency that will notice anytime we save our file, and it will go ahead and restart the server for us, so we don't have to do those manually. After that, we'll go ahead and add Socket.io. So just npm I socket.io, and this should add this as a regular dependency, not a dev dependency. So now let's check our package JSON file, and we can see we now have a dev dependencies section with nodemon, and we have a dependencies section that still has WS from the last tutorial, and now it has Socket.io. And we're not going to use WS today. So let's go ahead and open that terminal window once again and type npm uninstall WS. And now this should remove that dependency, and we'll check the package JSON again. So now we have exactly what we want, Socket.io here and nodemon here under dev dependencies. Now let's go ahead and add a dev start script as well. So we've got the comma, and now we'll add dev, and after dev, we're going to say nodemon instead of node with the period. So now we can type npm run dev. It will start our project up in dev mode, our server. And before I forget the last change in this file, I'm going to switch this from lesson 1 to lesson 2. With our package JSON and dependencies now updated, we are ready to move on to our server script. And we need to change a few things here. So we'll start at the top, and we're no longer using WS. So we can go ahead and remove that. And instead, I'm going to import and then curly brace, create server. And this is going to come from HTTP. And after I import create server, I need to import server with a capital S, and then that is going to come from socket.io. Now after that, I'm going to call this, we're getting too many server names in here. So instead of just defining server, I'm going to call this HTTP server. So I get just a little bit of a difference there so we know what we're referring to. And instead of this, we're just going to set that equal to create server and put the operators there to call it. And now that we've created a server, we can use, well, we'll define IO, and we'll set this equal to new server that we imported from socket.io. And now we can use that server we created. I'll put in the HTTP server here, and now we can put in options. This gives me a chance to talk about cores. Now, if you've already gone through my Node.js and Express course, there we discuss cores in depth and how to set all of that up for an Express server. However, this is different. Remember, this is not HTTP. We are now using WebSockets, and so we need to handle cores for that as well. And we can do that here in the options for socket.io. So we say cores. Now we're going to specify what the origin is that's accepted. Now you might have seen this before where they just put in the asterisk, and this means everything's accepted. Now be careful with this because this means no one is blocked. They can, anywhere gets access essentially. They can access this from anywhere. This is not what is recommended in the docs, and I don't recommend leaving that wide open either. Instead, let's go ahead and use the process.env setting for the environment that's there by default. So we can say process.env and now we can look at the node environment because we are on the node server, and we'll say if it equals production, and we want all lowercase here because this is a strict equals. Now I'm going to use a ternary statement. So we put a question mark, and this means if it equals production, then we'll just say false because we don't want anyone outside of the domain that is currently, the server is currently on to access it. But if it's not, if we're in development, then we'll go ahead and put an array, not curly braces, but an array, and we can put in the address that we will allow to access our socket.io server. So here I'll put // then I'm going to put localhost 5500 because that's where live server hosts our front-end application at. However, there's something that's going to come up with this, and I want to leave it this way to show you the issue. So I'll just leave it like this for now. Press Alt-Z to let all that wrap down. So this is one line of code essentially with this ternary statement, but now it's wrapping down here to the next line. And now another consideration here would be if you were hosting your backend server on a different domain, then you would need to give your front-end domain access because it would be a cross-origin resource request, what CORS is. So you might need to list one, even if it is production, if you're hosting the backend on a different domain than the front end, if they have a separation of concerns. Essentially, if you're not hosting your entire application, the server and the client on the same domain, you would need to list something here for production, of course. Okay, with our IO server now in place and cores handled, let's scroll for some more room, and we need to work with this. We're no longer referring to server here. This is going to be IO, and then we can still say .on, and we're still listening for a connection event, and we still get a socket here. This is all true. So after the socket, then we can do some different things. One, again, this being on the server, let's just log something first. I'll say console.log. And I want to log the user ID because as each user connects, they get a different ID. So we can look at that. I'll just say user, and then we'll use a template literal here, and I can say socket.id. So essentially every socket connection gets its own ID. And then we'll just say connected. So we'll get that message in the terminal. After that, now let's talk about what happens with the message. Here, we can say socket.onMessage. That is all accurate. And then we get a message here. You could refer to this as data as well. Now we don't have to worry about this buffer anymore. We're using socket.io. So that's not an issue if we want to see what we have received, but we could call this, and let me just Control D to select both. We could actually call this data that we are receiving, but we're not going to use socket send anymore. That's not the way we want to do this. So let's go ahead and say console.log, and we could log this data to see what we have received here. Now, after the data is logged, instead of socket, we'll say IO once again, and then instead of send, we'll say .emit. Now that is going to emit this message to everyone that's connected to the server, essentially. Now what we need to put inside the emit is, this is a message, so we're saying what it is, and then we can put a string of some sort here or whatever we want to send back. So we could just send that data back, or we could send a little bit more. How about we go ahead and send a little bit more? Let's put something in the string here. Let's do that socket ID again, but let's not, it's a long string, so let's not do the whole thing. So here I'll put socket.id.substring, and let's put the first 5 characters. How about that? Now after that, I'll put a colon and a space, and so then we'll get the message, but we'll identify whoever said it by the first 5 characters of that socket ID, and then we'll have the data here. That's all good, but once again, we need to add one more thing for the server. So we got the socket, or we have socket.io here with the connection, and we have it emitting messages to everyone, any message it receives. But after that, we want to go ahead and make sure the server is listening. So down here, we have an HTTP server that we have from above. Now let's say .listen, and let's say we're going to listen on port 3500. I think I had maybe 3000 in the last tutorial. I'm switching it to 3500 because if I remember correctly, maybe React is going to, by default, put an application on 3000, and maybe we'll create a React app later in this series. But for now, we'll just put this on 3500, and then we have an anonymous function here, and we can console.log. And inside this log, we'll just say listening on port 3500 and save. And now our server code should be complete. And now we're ready to move on to the client code. But before we do that, we need to import the socket.io library for the front-end application as well. I am at CDN.js, where we can get a library from that CDN. And now let's scroll down to look at our options. And of course, it just shows us this first option right here, which is fine. It's not minified though, so I would be more likely to go ahead and select the minified version down here. But if you're curious what the ESM means, that's referring to ES modules. Let's go ahead and look at the docs and just see what they talk about when we use this version versus this version. I'm at client initialization in the docs, and as I scroll down, if we use that script import that we first looked at, this doesn't show the minified version, but we can still get a minified version, then that's all we need to do. We just add this to our HTML file. But notice the ESM here. If we use that, we need to say script type module, and then in our JavaScript, we would need to import IO from the name of that module, essentially, that's over here, or like they show the CDN, we would put in that full CDN address, essentially, is where we would import that from. So that's the difference when we look at those CDN files. So when I go back here, I'm not going to get this one because, like I said, I want it minified, but I'm not getting this one either because I don't want to do that import today. I'm just going to grab this socket.io.min.js. So we can copy the URL, or you can copy the full script tag here from this cdnjs.com where I'm getting these different library links. So I'll copy that script tag. Now let's head back to VS Code. And I'm back in VS Code. I've got the app directory open now, and I have highlighted the index.html file. This script tag needs to go in here before our app.js script tag, because our app.js file is going to use what it gets from this library. So let's go ahead and paste this in. I'll press Alt-Z to wrap it down. You can see when we copy the script tag from cdn.js, it gives us a few more attributes as well. So these are in here. I wouldn't know what to put with those, but if you copy that, it's going to put these in and possibly do an integrity check and just have a couple of others here as well. And they won't hurt anything if you put those in. So I'm just going to save it as is, just like I copied it from cdn.js. And we're ready to move on to the app.js file. No changes in the CSS today. Okay, let's start at the top. We're still going to define socket, but we will not have a new WebSocket because we're now using socket IO. So I'm going to use IO. Note that I don't have to import it because, like I said, we're not using that module. We're just using that script import where I don't have to import. So I can just refer to IO automatically now. Our send message function essentially stays the same from what we had before, except we're not doing socket.send. We are doing socket.emit. So we are emitting a message, and that's what we need to say. The first thing we put in is, what is this? And this is a message. And then we're going to send that input value once again. And those are the only changes for the send message function. From here, we still want to call the send message function when we submit the form. So that doesn't change at all. But here we are going to change how we listen for messages. We're no longer going to have socket.addEventListener. We're going to have socket.on, and then on is the message event. So when we get a message, then we are going to call this function. This is very similar. However, we do not need to destructure this anymore. We will just receive data. After that, we will have li, and we'll create that as we were before. And now we'll set this text content equal to that same data, and we will still append the li to the ul. So no more changes. That's all we need. Okay, with all of our changes in place, we're now ready to start the server and then start the client application. So I'm going to open a terminal window, and then I'm going to make sure I'm still in that server directory so I can start the server. I'll type npm run dev, which should start our server in dev mode, and that's what we've got. So nodemon started the server in dev mode, and it's listing on port 3500. That's exactly what we want. Now let's ensure at the top of our file, note we still had localhost 3000. So I want to change this to 3500 before we start the client application as well. So now we are going to be sending this to localhost 3500. So now let's go back to the index.html, and anywhere here you should be able to right click or command click and then choose open with live server if you installed that from the last tutorial, and this will launch the front end application in the browser. And here it is. I'm going to go ahead and open a dev console as well with the Control, Shift, and letter I keys. And now we have a CORS error. So let me clear this out and make sure we get that CORS error again. And yes, this is what I expected. And I want to talk about that. Notice the address that our app is at. It's not at localhost. It's at 127.0.0.1. which is the same thing. It's translated to the same thing on our computer as localhost, but CORS reads this literally and says, hey, this is not the address you gave permission to access our WebSocket application. So let's go back and look at that server code. I'll pull this up and let's go to the index.js for the server. And you can see for CORS, we're only allowing localhost. We did not put in that other address. So I'm going to copy this, Control C here. We could just change it, but let's go ahead and put in both. I'll paste in that same address. I'm going to change this now to 127.0.0.1. So no matter if I use that or I use localhost, it should now allow it. So after I save, open the terminal, we can see nodemon already restarted the server, listening on port 3500, and we can see our front-end application already connected because here is the console log message. So here's that long string that is the socket ID, and it's now connected. If we go back and look at the code, we can see we had that console log right here. So let's go to our application now on the front end. Here, there's no more errors when I refresh, no CORS errors, everything is good. So that's good. Let's open this same application now in a second window here, a second tab. Get this open in both, and now I'm going to drag these so I can have both visible. I've got one here on the right. The one on the left will be a little bit bigger from the way I'd shared my screen, but that's fine. Here, I'm going to send a message. I'm just going to say, hey there, and press enter to send. Notice it appeared on both screens. So somebody that opened the front-end application over here is different than somebody over here, and we can tell that when this person sends a message and they have a different ID. And we say hi, and now you can see that this ID, of course, being different than that, and now it was sent to both as well. So you can see what you typed in a chat message, and of course, they can see what you typed as well. This is a very, very basic Socket.io chat application. So if this was all you're looking for, I guess you're already all the way there, but we can do much more with this as well. And we're going to learn in future tutorials how to send messages to other specific users and chat rooms and all of those things. Show how somebody's typing and the other person can see that they're typing, that, oh yeah, they're thinking about what they're going to send me. All of that good stuff that you like to see in chat applications. I also thought about adding the Express server today, but I think I'll do that in the next tutorial as well. Remember to keep striving for progress over perfection, and a little progress every day will go a very long way. Please give this video a like if it's helped you, and thank you for watching and subscribing. You're helping my channel grow. Have a great day, and let's write more code together very soon.